In 1845, the Cork and Bandon Railway held its inaugural meeting with the intention of connecting the city of Cork to the market town of Bandon. Construction began in 1846, and by 1849, the first section of the railway line between Bandon and Ballinhassig was open. In a time of famine, the railway brought work to those who needed it. And there was work to be done. Huge viaducts, embankments and tunnels needed to be constructed. Another section connecting Ballinhassig to Cork had to be finished. This section had rather large viaducts, long tunnels and big embankments that needed to be constructed. This was finally completed in 1851. In 1863, a branch between Kinsale and Crossbarry was constructed. However, this line never had great receipts and was eventually absorbed into the Cork and Bandon Railway by 1880. Another company set up a line connecting Cork to Macroom. However, this company would not give up its independence so easily. The consequences of this will be very apparent later on. In the same year, a line connecting Bandon to Dunmanway was built by the West Cork Railway Company. A very straight and easy route. This company would have its own terminus in Bandon, separate from the Cork and Bandon's one. Another company, the Island Valley Railway, decided to build a line between Dunmanway and Skibbereen. However, this section of line was a little bit more rocky than what was experienced by the West Cork Railway when they built their line. Not much has appeared on the map since, but a brand new terminus has popped up in Cork. A falling out between the Cork and Bandon Railway and the Cork and Macroom Railway meant that the Cork and Macroom Railway built its own terminus at Capwell. It then disconnected from the Cork and Bandon Railway and remained fully independent from the rest of the network until 1918, when finally the government stepped in. In 1881, a branch between Timoelague and Bantry was constructed. This made Timoelague, a small village at the time, a very important railway junction, something that the brand newly formed Cork, Bandon and South Coast Railway could be proud of. In 1886, the Schull and Skibbereen Railway and the Clonakilty branch were built. The Clonakilty railway station was built well above the town, providing a view. The Schull and Skibbereen Railway, meanwhile, was a different kettle of fish altogether. It was built on 3-foot gauge track to a very cheap standard. This meant that it could not connect with the other West Cork railway systems and would remain independent its entire life. It had character though, and so did this next section of the West Cork Railway, the Timoelague and Courtmacsherry branch, which ran along the side of the road between Timoelague and Courtmacsherry. Many of those who were around in the 1960s will remember seaside tours down to Courtmacsherry from Cork along this beautiful coastal route. In the early 1890s, the Cork, Bandon and South Coast Railway began modifying some of its stations. Nowhere can this be seen more than in Bantry, where an entirely new railway station was built, which required a long section of track to be built around the town. The new station, conveniently located right beside the pier, meant that you could connect with ferries to Adrigole, Glengariff and Castletownbere. The final extension to the West Cork Railway was south of Skibbereen to Baltimore. This made Baltimore the most southern railway terminus in Ireland. From the 1890s to the mid-1910s, the railways were at their height. Railways in Ireland, however, were in for a huge shock. The First World War, the War of Independence, and finally the Civil War did tremendous financial and physical damage to all railways in Ireland. The new Free State government gave the Railways of Ireland an ultimatum: join up or not get funding at all. In 1924, the Cork, Bandon and South Coast Railway became one of the founder members of the Great Southern Railway. The Great Southern Railway, however, had a lot of competition. Cheap trucks were made available by the British Army following World War I, and the development of the internal combustion engine meant for the first time buses were starting to poke in on the railway's monopoly. The Great Southern Railway, which was losing a lot of money, decided to make drastic action in the early 30s, closing the Kinsale branch line outright. Now, this wasn't much of a loss, as the Kinsale branch could easily be served by trucks and buses, as the road was actually much shorter than the rail route. However, this historic event would set the precedent to come. In the mid-30s, the Macroom Railway lost its passenger services, going down to freight only. Not only that, but a lot of the narrow gauge systems and trams working around Cork were shut down. During the Second World War, railways in Ireland came to an absolute standstill, and even for about a decade after the emergency, there was no coal to go around. Because of this, the Courtmacsherry branch lost its passenger service, which never returned, and the Schull and Skibbereen closed outright. This also would never return, with trains coming in 1953 to take away its remaining stock. In 1945, the Great Southern Railway would be absorbed into CIE, Corus CIE was then nationalised in 1950. However, this did not mean the end to the closures. Due to a building of a dam in Enniscarra which flooded much of the trackbed coming into Macroom, the Macroom line was abandoned outright, with the last train running in 1953. The 1950s were a pretty awful time to be living in Ireland. Lots of immigration and no money to go around. Yet the West Cork Railway soldiered on, hoping that it would live another day. As the 1950s went on, a change began to take place. CIE began to invest in some brand new diesels, and the West Cork Railway was looking arguably better than ever.
They passed the largest single order ever placed with any manufacturer in Great Britain by ordering 99 engines made by Crossbarry Brothers Limited to power their locomotives. Here in England, the CIE officials inspect the first Class A-type locomotive.
However, these new diesels would flop, being horrendously unreliable. In early 1960, the hammer dropped. The entire West Cork railway system was to close. Every branch line, even the main line. Naturally, there was huge backlash. Groups were set up, 37,000 signatures were collected to be given to Eamon de Valera, then president, and a High Court case was said to take place with James P. O'Regan leading the charge. However, the expense was too much and this was let go, and on the 1st of April 1962, the lifting of the West Cork Railway began at Baltimore and started making its way back towards Cork. Here recorded by RTE News, a brand new organisation at the time, on April Fool's Day 1962. By 1963, they had reached Timoelague, Bandon was reached by 1964, and by 1965, the entire remains of the West Cork Railway were lifted. However, this was not the end of the West Cork Railway as we knew it. CIE kept Albert Quay open as a rail freight yard. However, it was only accessible by trains going through Cork City's streets. This was a fascinating operation which continued up to 1976, when it was finally replaced with the North Esk Yard. However, during this time, County Council tar and Goulding's fertiliser would have made their way into Albert Quay. The closure and dismantling of Albert Quay killed any chance of the West Cork Railway ever being revived, and therefore, in my opinion, was the final straw in the West Cork Railway's life.